First-class meals aren't for passengers like you. The words landed across the quiet cabin like a sudden storm, turning heads before anyone even understood what had happened. At 7:42 p.m. on a flight from New York to Los Angeles, Danielle Brooks sat calmly in seat 3A, looking out through the window as the city lights disappeared beneath the clouds. She wasn't wearing a designer suit. She wasn't surrounded by assistants. There was no luxury handbag, no flashy jewelry, no sign that the woman quietly reading a report on her tablet was one of the most powerful executives in American aviation. She wore a simple black blazer, dark jeans, and comfortable leather shoes. To most people on that plane, she looked like any other first-class passenger. But to Rebecca Collins, the lead flight attendant walking down the aisle, she looked like someone who didn't belong. Rebecca stopped beside Danielle's seat with a polished smile that never reached her eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There seems to be a mistake with your meal selection." Danielle slowly looked up. "A mistake?" she asked calmly. Rebecca glanced at the screen in her hand. "Yes. The premium dining service is reserved for confirmed first-class guests with approved selections." Danielle looked at the ticket beside her cup of water. "My seat is 3A. My meal was included when I booked." Rebecca paused for a moment, then looked around the cabin before lowering her voice. "Sometimes people misunderstand what they purchase." The sentence was quiet, but everyone nearby heard it. Danielle didn't react the way Rebecca expected. No anger, no argument, no raised voice. She simply watched. She had seen that look before. The same look from boardrooms where people questioned whether she belonged. The same look from investors who underestimated her because of her appearance before ever reading her achievements. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't walking into someone else's company. She was observing her own. Danielle Brooks was the CEO of Aurelia Aviation Group, the company that had recently become one of the largest shareholders in the airline operating this flight. She had chosen this trip for one reason: to see the customer experience without anyone knowing her name. She wanted the truth, not a performance. Rebecca turned toward another crew member, Brian Wallace, who immediately stepped closer. "Maybe we can offer you another option," he said with a tone that suggested the problem was Danielle herself, not the service. Danielle looked at the untouched menu in her hands and then back at them. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said. "I'm asking for the treatment I already paid for." The cabin became quieter. A few passengers looked up from their screens. A man across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman near the window stopped typing on her laptop. Everyone could feel something changing. Rebecca straightened her uniform and replied, "We have standards in first class." Danielle held her gaze for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "I understand." But what Rebecca didn't understand was that those 3 words were not surrender. They were a warning. Because Danielle Brooks had spent decades building a company from moments exactly like this. Moments when people decided who she was before they knew her name. And now, sitting quietly in seat 3A, she wasn't just waiting for a meal. She was watching a company reveal itself one decision at a time. Danielle Brooks had learned something early in her career. The most revealing moments were not the ones that happened when people knew her name. They were the moments when they thought nobody important was watching. As the cabin lights dimmed and the flight continued across the country, Danielle remained seated quietly in 3A, her untouched meal tray still sitting on the table in front of her. Rebecca Collins had moved on to the next row, but the tension she created had not disappeared. It stayed in the air like a question nobody wanted to answer. Danielle opened her tablet again, but she was not reading the financial report on the screen. She was reviewing notes from a completely different project. For months, she had received customer complaints about inconsistent treatment on premium flights. Some passengers described feeling ignored. Others described being judged before they ever spoke. The airline always responded with the same polished statements about service standards and customer care. But Danielle knew numbers could hide reality. That was why she was there. No announcement, no executive introduction, no special welcome, just a seat, a ticket, and a chance to see what happened when nobody knew who she was. 20 years earlier, Danielle had walked into her first major investment meeting wearing a simple navy suit and carrying a folder full of ideas. She remembered the way people looked at her before she said a single word. They questioned whether she had enough experience, whether she had the right connections, whether someone like her could lead a company in a competitive industry. They never saw the late nights, the sacrifices, or the years she spent building something from nothing. They only saw what they expected to see. That memory had stayed with her, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Success was not just about reaching the top. It was about understanding the barriers other people still faced while trying to get there. Back on the plane, a young flight attendant named Emily Parker approached Danielle carefully. She had been watching the situation from a distance. "I apologize for the confusion," Emily said softly. "I checked the system, and your meal selection is actually confirmed." Danielle looked up and gave a small smile. "Thank you for checking." Emily hesitated. "I just wanted to make sure everything was handled correctly." It was a simple sentence, but it mattered. Because in that moment, Danielle saw something different. Not everyone on the crew had accepted the assumption that she did not belong. But before Emily could walk away, Rebecca returned. Her expression was more serious now. She had noticed Emily speaking with Danielle. "Is there a problem?" Rebecca asked. Emily looked uncomfortable, but answered honestly. "I was just confirming the reservation details." Rebecca glanced at the screen in Emily's hand, then back at Danielle. "There is no need to make this complicated." Danielle slowly closed her tablet. The entire situation had reached a new stage. This was no longer about a missing meal. It was about how quickly a small decision could reveal a much bigger problem. Rebecca looked around the cabin, confident that her authority was unquestioned. She did not know that every word, every action, and every decision was becoming part of a record Danielle would soon review. Then Rebecca made one more choice that changed everything. She reached for the service tablet and said, "I think we need to document this passenger." Rebecca Collins held the service tablet in her hand as if it were proof that she had already decided what kind of passenger Danielle Brooks was. The cabin remained quiet, but the atmosphere had changed. A few passengers who had been focused on movies and books were now paying attention. They could sense the difference between a simple service issue and a situation becoming something much bigger. "Document what exactly?" Danielle asked calmly. Rebecca looked surprised by the question. "Your behavior," she replied. "The confusion you are creating with the crew." Danielle looked at her for a moment, almost as if she was studying the words rather than reacting to them. "I asked for the meal that was included with my ticket," she said. "That is not confusion." Brian Wallace stepped closer, supporting Rebecca without hesitation. "Our crew has procedures for situations like this," he said. "We are trying to keep everything professional." Danielle glanced toward him. Professional means following the rules consistently. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. Emily Parker stood nearby, listening carefully. She knew something was wrong. She had checked the system herself. Danielle's reservation was clear. First-class seating. Premium meal selection. Everything matched exactly. But Rebecca was not interested in checking the information again. She was interested in proving her first assumption was correct. "You know," Rebecca said, lowering her voice slightly, "sometimes passengers misunderstand the level of service they are entitled to." The words hung in the air. A man sitting across the aisle slowly lowered his headphones. A woman near the front row exchanged a glance with her husband. They were no longer watching a disagreement. They were watching a choice being made. Danielle looked down at the tablet on her lap. For a moment, she remembered another time, years ago, when she had entered a conference room full of executives. She had prepared a presentation that could have changed the future of a company. But before she even finished introducing herself, one person asked if she was there to take notes for someone else. She remembered the feeling of being underestimated. She remembered the silence she carried afterward. But she also remembered what she did next. She built. She learned. She became the person who could no longer be ignored. Back on the airplane, Danielle placed her tablet on the tray table. "Rebecca," she said calmly, "I want to understand something." Rebecca crossed her arms. "What is that?" Danielle looked directly at her. "If another passenger in this seat had a different appearance, would you have questioned their meal the same way?" The question created a silence that felt heavier than before. Rebecca did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward Brian. "I think we need the captain involved." Emily's expression changed. "The captain? For a confirmed meal request." Rebecca ignored her. She pressed a button on the service panel and requested assistance from the cockpit. Moments later, Captain Michael Hayes received the message and began walking toward first class. Danielle watched him approach from the aisle. She knew this moment mattered. Not because of the meal, not because of the inconvenience, but because every decision made from this point forward would reveal exactly what kind of company this airline truly was. And when Captain Hayes arrived, Rebecca was already preparing to tell the story her way. Captain Michael Hayes stepped into the first-class cabin with a calm expression, unaware that the few minutes ahead would become one of the most important moments of his career. Rebecca Collins immediately turned toward him, ready with her explanation. "Captain, we have a passenger creating a service issue," she said. "She is refusing to cooperate with the crew." Danielle Brooks looked toward the captain, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most revealing thing was not what people said about you, but what they said when they believed nobody would challenge them. Captain Hayes looked at Danielle, then at Rebecca. "What seems to be the problem?" Rebecca quickly answered. "There was confusion about the first-class meal service. We tried to explain the policy, but the passenger is making it difficult." Danielle quietly placed her ticket information on the tray table. "Captain, there is no confusion. My meal was confirmed. The crew member decided I did not qualify before checking the details." The captain looked at the information, then back at Rebecca. "Did you verify the reservation?" Rebecca hesitated for just a second. It was small, almost invisible, but Danielle noticed it. Emily Parker noticed it too. "I checked it," Emily said softly. "Her meal selection is confirmed in the system." Rebecca looked at Emily with disappointment. "Emily, this is not the time to complicate things." Emily stood still. She was young, but she understood something important. Following instructions was part of her job. Ignoring what was right was not. "I am not trying to complicate anything," Emily replied. "I am just saying the information is clear." The cabin became even quieter. Jason Miller, a passenger sitting 2 rows behind Danielle, watched the exchange carefully. He had noticed everything from the beginning. The missing meal, the comments, the way Danielle had remained calm while everyone else became uncomfortable. He quietly opened his phone, not to create a scene, but because he felt people should be accountable for what they did in public. Captain Hayes looked at the tablet in Rebecca's hand. "Why was this passenger documented?" he asked. Rebecca answered quickly. "Because she challenged the crew and created unnecessary tension." Danielle looked at the captain. "Is asking for a service that is included with my ticket considered creating tension?" Nobody answered immediately. The question stayed in the air. Captain Hayes looked uncomfortable. He had expected a difficult passenger. Instead, he found a calm person with a valid reservation and a crew member who had already made assumptions. Danielle watched the reactions around her. Some people looked away. Some looked concerned. One passenger whispered, "She has been respectful the whole time." Rebecca heard it. Her expression changed slightly. She realized the room was no longer automatically on her side. But instead of stepping back, she made another decision. She reached for the communication device and said, "Captain, I think we need to review her passenger status." Danielle slowly turned her head. That sentence was different. This was no longer about a meal. It was about questioning whether she belonged there at all. And as Captain Hayes prepared to access the passenger records, Danielle received a message on her phone. The screen lit up with one sentence from her executive assistant. "Danielle, we have identified the crew involved. Do you want us to begin the review?" The message on Danielle Brooks's phone remained visible for only a few seconds, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened since she boarded the plane. "Danielle, we have identified the crew involved. Do you want us to begin the review?" She quietly turned the screen off and placed the phone back beside her tablet. She did not rush. She did not react. She simply looked at the people standing around her and allowed the moment to speak for itself. Captain Michael Hayes noticed the change in her expression. It was not anger. It was something calmer, something more certain. "Ma'am, we are just trying to understand what happened here," he said. Danielle nodded. "Then understand all of it, Captain. Not just the part that is easiest to believe." Rebecca Collins stepped forward before the captain could respond. "This is becoming unnecessary," she said. "We have policies for situations like this." Danielle looked at her. "Policies are important, but they should protect people, not assumptions." The words were simple, but they changed the feeling in the cabin. Several passengers looked at each other. They had heard every conversation. They had seen Danielle remain respectful while others questioned her place in the cabin. Jason Miller lowered his phone slightly, but continued recording. He was not interested in creating drama. He wanted a record of what happened. Rebecca noticed the attention shifting and became more defensive. "Captain, I believe we should verify everything before allowing this situation to continue." Danielle heard the wording carefully. Verify everything. The phrase sounded professional, but she understood what was hidden underneath. She had heard versions of it throughout her entire career. A request for more proof. A request for more explanation. A request to prove she belonged in a space where others were automatically accepted. Years earlier, Danielle remembered standing outside a corporate office after an important meeting. She had arrived early, prepared, and confident. A receptionist looked at her credentials, then looked at her again. "Are you sure you are here for the executive meeting?" the woman had asked. Danielle remembered that moment because it taught her something powerful. People often reveal their beliefs before they reveal their intentions. She did not let that moment stop her. She used it as motivation. She built companies. She created opportunities. She became someone whose decisions affected thousands of people. And now, decades later, she was sitting in a first-class cabin watching the same assumption appear again. Captain Hayes opened the passenger information system and reviewed the details. His expression changed slightly. The reservation was valid. The meal request was valid. Everything Danielle had said from the beginning was correct. "Rebecca," he said slowly, "the passenger information appears to be accurate." For the first time, Rebecca looked uncertain. There must be another explanation. Emily Parker looked at the captain. "There is no missing information. Everything was already there." The silence that followed felt different. The power in the cabin had shifted. Danielle picked up her tablet and calmly opened a document. She looked at Rebecca one more time. "The question is no longer whether I was entitled to a meal." She paused. "The question is why proving I belonged became more important than simply treating me like a customer." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Danielle's phone rang. She answered quietly. On the other end was her executive assistant, Rachel. "Danielle," Rachel said, "the board has reviewed the initial report. They are asking for your authorization to access the full crew performance records." Danielle looked toward the front of the cabin as Rebecca and the rest of the crew waited, unaware of what was coming next. She took a breath and gave one calm instruction. "Begin the review." The moment Danielle Brooks gave the instruction, the energy inside the first-class cabin changed completely. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She simply returned to her seat and allowed the process she had built over years to begin. Rachel's voice remained steady through the phone. "The executive review has started. We are pulling service records, customer feedback reports, and crew performance notes from the last 12 months. Danielle looked out the window at the darkness beyond the glass. "Include everything," she said. "Every complaint, every report, every response." Captain Michael Hayes watched her carefully. He still did not fully understand who she was, but he understood one thing now. This was not a passenger trying to win an argument. This was someone searching for the truth. Rebecca Collins stood near the aisle, uncomfortable with the silence that followed. "I think this is becoming exaggerated," she said. "A simple misunderstanding is turning into something much bigger." Danielle looked at her calmly. "A misunderstanding is when people make a mistake and correct it. This was a decision made before the facts were checked." The sentence stayed with everyone listening. Emily Parker looked down at the service tablet in her hands. She knew Danielle was right. The information had been available from the beginning. The meal was confirmed. The seat was confirmed. There was never a reason to question it. Jason Miller, still seated nearby, looked at the recording on his phone. He had captured the entire interaction. The comments. The assumptions. The moment Danielle was treated differently without anyone knowing her background. He quietly said, "I think people need to see this." Danielle turned toward him. "A video is not the solution," she replied. "Facts are." Jason lowered his phone slightly and nodded. That response surprised him. He expected someone in her position to focus on public attention. Instead, she focused on accountability. That was when Rachel called again. "Danielle, we found something." Danielle listened carefully. Several customer complaints mentioned similar concerns about premium service interactions. Some reports describe passengers feeling judged before staff reviewed their reservations. Captain Hayes looked up when he heard those words. Rebecca's expression changed. "Those are unrelated situations," she said quickly. Danielle looked toward her. "Are they?" Rebecca did not answer. For years, Danielle had learned that patterns rarely appeared in one moment. They appeared through repeated choices. A comment here, an assumption there, a decision made without asking the right question. Small moments that revealed larger problems. Rachel continued, "There is more." The review team also found that some complaints were marked as resolved without full follow-up. The cabin became silent again. This was no longer about one meal. It was about responsibility. Captain Hayes slowly placed the tablet down. Rebecca, why was this passenger documented before the reservation was verified? Rebecca searched for an answer. I was trying to protect the service standards of the cabin. Danielle looked at her. Standards are important, but standards without fairness become something else. Emily watched Danielle carefully. She realized this woman was not trying to punish anyone. She was trying to show what happened when people were judged before they were understood. Then Rachel spoke one final sentence that changed the entire situation. Danielle, the board is ready for your identity confirmation. They want to know if you want to reveal who you are. Danielle looked around the cabin. Rebecca, Brian, Captain Hayes, Emily, the passengers quietly watching. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she pressed the phone closer and answered with a calm voice. Not yet. Let them hear the full story first. For several seconds, nobody inside the first-class cabin spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when everyone realized the truth was much larger than they first believed. Danielle Brooks remained seated, calm and composed, while the people around her waited for the next moment. Rebecca Collins looked toward Captain Michael Hayes, hoping he would bring the situation back under her control. But the captain was no longer looking at Danielle as a difficult passenger. He was looking at her as someone who had been telling the truth from the beginning. Danielle, Rachel's voice came through the phone again. The board is asking for confirmation. They are ready. Danielle looked at the screen for a moment. Then she slowly placed the phone down. She had waited long enough. Not because she needed to prove herself, but because she wanted everyone to understand the reason behind what happened. Captain Hayes, Danielle said calmly. Before I tell you who I am, I want you to understand something. The captain listened carefully. This was never about a meal. It was never about a seat. It was about what happens when someone decides who deserves respect before knowing anything about them. The cabin became completely still. Danielle stood from her seat, not dramatically, but with the confidence of someone who had spent years carrying responsibility. She looked around at the passengers who had watched everything unfold. My name is Danielle Brooks. Rebecca's expression changed slightly, but she still did not understand. Danielle continued. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Aurelia Aviation Group. The words moved through the cabin like a sudden change in weather. A few passengers looked at each other in disbelief. Jason Miller lowered his phone for a moment, realizing the person he had been recording was not just another customer. Captain Hayes looked at the information on the tablet again. Then he looked back at Danielle. Aurelia Aviation Group, he repeated quietly. Danielle nodded. Yes, the company that recently became one of the largest shareholders connected to this airline. Rebecca's confidence disappeared. The same person she had questioned moments earlier was now standing in front of her as one of the people responsible for the future of the organization. But Danielle did not smile. She did not celebrate the moment. She simply looked at Rebecca and said, The surprising part is not that you did not recognize me. Her voice remained calm. The surprising part is how you treated someone you thought had no power. Nobody had an answer. Brian Wallace looked down, realizing every assumption he had made was now visible. Emily Parker stood quietly, knowing she had witnessed a moment that would change how people viewed customer service. Captain Hayes took a deep breath. Ms. Brooks, I apologize. I should have asked more questions before making any judgment. Danielle nodded slightly. Accountability starts with recognizing what happened. Then Rachel's voice returned through the phone. Danielle, the full review is complete. We have identified additional concerns involving the crew's previous interactions with passengers. Danielle looked toward the front of the cabin. The reveal had happened. The truth was finally visible. But the most important decision had not been made yet. She looked at Rebecca, then at the crew members standing nearby. Now, Danielle said quietly, we discuss what happens next. The cabin remained silent after Danielle Brooks revealed her identity. But the silence was different now. It was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with reflection. Rebecca Collins stood near the aisle, looking at the same woman she had questioned only minutes earlier. The difference was not Danielle's clothing, not her seat, not her name. The difference was that everyone finally understood what had been there all along. She had always belonged. Captain Michael Hayes looked down at the report on the tablet one more time. The information was clear. The service complaint history, the passenger feedback, the repeated concerns, the pattern that had been overlooked for too long. Ms. Brooks, he said carefully, I want to apologize on behalf of the crew. Danielle nodded, but did not immediately respond. She looked toward Rebecca and Brian. An apology matters, she said. But an apology without change becomes just another sentence people forget. Rebecca looked uncomfortable. The confidence she had carried earlier was gone. I did not know who you were, she said quietly. Danielle looked at her. That is exactly the point. The words were calm, but they carried the weight of the entire situation. You did not know my position. You did not know my company. You did not know my background. You only knew what you assumed when you looked at me. Nobody interrupted. Even the passengers watching from their seats remained quiet. Jason Miller looked at his phone, where the recording had captured every important moment. But now he understood why Danielle had refused to focus on the video. The most powerful part was not that people would watch it later. The most powerful part was that the people in that cabin had witnessed the truth themselves. Rachel's voice came through the phone again. Danielle, the review team has completed the initial findings. The board has authorized immediate action. Danielle closed her eyes for a brief moment. She had spent years building Aurelia Aviation Group around one principle. Companies were not defined only by their profits. They were defined by how they treated people when nobody important was watching. She turned toward Captain Hayes. I do not want anyone removed because they made one mistake. The captain listened carefully. But I do expect accountability when someone chooses a pattern over a correction. She looked at Rebecca. You had several opportunities to fix this situation. You could have checked the reservation. You could have listened to Emily. You could have treated me like a customer instead of a problem. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Brian remained silent. He knew the moment had moved beyond a misunderstanding. Emily Parker stepped forward. I want to say something, she said. Danielle nodded. Emily looked around the cabin. I think this is important because everyone saw the same thing happen. The information was there. The answer was there. The only thing missing was someone willing to look. Danielle gave her a small smile. That was the kind of leadership she believed in. Not people who stayed silent to protect comfort, but people who spoke when something was wrong. Rachel spoke again. Danielle, the board is waiting for your final decision regarding the crew review. Danielle looked toward the front of the aircraft. She knew this decision would not only affect the people standing in front of her. It would send a message throughout the entire company. She took a slow breath and answered, Proceed with the formal review. The words were quiet, but everyone understood what they meant. The investigation had officially begun, and the people who thought they controlled the situation were about to face the consequences of the choices they made. The flight continued through the night, but the moment inside the first-class cabin had already changed everything. What started as a simple request for a meal had revealed something much deeper. It revealed how quickly assumptions could replace understanding, and how one quiet voice could expose a problem that had been ignored for too long. Danielle Brooks remained in her seat as the formal review moved forward. She did not celebrate. She did not demand attention. She simply watched as accountability began to take its place. A few hours earlier, she had entered the aircraft as a passenger nobody recognized. Now, everyone knew exactly who she was. But Danielle understood something important. Her identity was never the reason she deserved respect. She deserved respect before anyone knew her name. Captain Michael Hayes approached her before the flight landed. His expression was different now, more thoughtful, more aware. Ms. Brooks, I want to thank you for the way you handled this situation, he said. You gave everyone a chance to do the right thing before making any decisions. Danielle nodded. That is because the goal was never embarrassment. The goal was improvement. Those words stayed with him. Because that was the difference between revenge and leadership. Revenge focuses on making someone feel the same pain. Leadership focuses on making sure the same mistake does not happen again. After the flight landed in Los Angeles, Aurelia Aviation Group released a statement announcing a complete review of premium service procedures. The company introduced additional training, stronger accountability measures, and a new commitment to ensuring every passenger was treated with dignity before assumptions were made. Rebecca Collins and Brian Wallace were placed under formal review based on their actions and previous service records. The decision was not about one moment alone. It was about understanding the responsibility that came with representing a company and serving the public. Emily Parker continued working with the airline, becoming known as someone who valued honesty over convenience. She often remembered that night because it reminded her that doing the right thing did not always require a loud voice. Sometimes it only required someone willing to speak when everyone else stayed quiet. Months later, Danielle returned to the same airline, but this time she did not come to test anyone. She came to see the changes. She walked through the terminal wearing the same simple style she had worn before. No announcement, no special treatment, just Danielle Brooks. And this time, the difference was not that people recognized her. The difference was that people treated every passenger with the same respect. Looking back on that night, Danielle never considered it a victory because someone lost their position. She considered it a victory because a company had been forced to look honestly at itself. She had spent years building success, but she knew true leadership was measured by something greater than wealth or influence. It was measured by the impact you create when you have the power to change things. The lesson was simple. A person's value is not determined by their appearance, their clothing, or the assumptions others place on them. Real power does not need to announce itself. Real confidence does not need to prove itself. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who has the greatest strength. Danielle Brooks walked onto that plane as someone others underestimated. She walked away as a reminder that dignity belongs to everyone, and respect should never depend on whether someone knows your name.